Close your eyes and imagine this: a quiet morning in ancient Greece, where nothing stirs except the wind brushing over two silent hills, Evus on the left, Olympus on the right. Between them lies a narrow pass, ordinary to the eye, yet destined to hold the fate of an entire city. Sparta, a land of warriors and kings, stands at a crossroads. Its independence, its future, everything it has built, hanging by a fragile thread. You can almost hear the whisper of soldiers preparing, the cautious steps of commanders plotting, the tension in the air before the storm. Something monumental is about to happen here, something that will echo through history. And yet, no one knows who will emerge victorious, or who will vanish forever. This is the story of the Battle of Sellasia, a confrontation that would mark the end of Sparta's independence, the last stand of a civilization once feared and respected across Greece. But before the clash of shields and spears, we must understand the world that shaped this moment, the ambitions, the fears, and the decisions that led two powerful forces to this narrow valley. Sparta had not always been a city in decline. Centuries earlier, its soldiers had been legends, trained from childhood in the agog, a system designed to forge disciplined, fearless warriors. Spartan kings led armies with unmatched authority, embodying both political and martial power. Yet, over time, Sparta's rigid system softened, wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, and many citizens lost their land and influence. Its once formidable army dwindled, and the city's confidence eroded. Into this delicate situation came Cleomenes III, a king determined to restore Sparta's former glory. His reforms were sweeping and deliberate. He redistributed land to empower citizens, ensuring a larger base of men could bear arms. He revived the agoge, teaching young men endurance, discipline, and loyalty to the collective. For Cleomenes, military strength was inseparable from social cohesion. Every soldier was a citizen, every citizen a soldier, each carrying the weight of Sparta's past on their shoulders. His vision went beyond the battlefield. Politically, Cleomenes centralized authority, allowing him to implement reforms without obstruction. This concentration of power was controversial, but it allowed the city to act decisively in a volatile world. Sparta, under his guidance, began to function as a unified organism once again, disciplined and purposeful, aware that survival depended on courage, planning, and unity. Yet Sparta was not alone in its world. To the north, Macedonia loomed, led by Antigonus III Doson, a king known for strategy, patience, and precise command. Macedonia had long maintained influence over Greek city-states, using diplomacy, alliances, and military power to secure its interests. A resurgent Sparta was not only a threat to Macedonian allies, but a potential spark of rebellion. Antigonus's attention was focused, his armies ready to act at the right moment. Meanwhile, the Achaean League, a coalition of Peloponnesian city-states, watched Sparta with apprehension. They remembered centuries of Spartan dominance and feared that Cleomenes' reforms would upset the fragile balance of power. Seeking protection, they appealed to Macedonia, unknowingly setting the stage for a decisive confrontation. Cleomenes responded with both boldness and caution. His early campaigns in the Peloponnese expanded Sparta's influence and demonstrated the effectiveness of his reforms. Yet these victories only heightened tensions. Allies of the League began preparing defenses. Macedon mobilized, and the world grew aware that conflict was inevitable. Every decision, every march of troops, brought Sparta closer to the edge of war. Now, return to the hills of Sellasia. Cleomenes positioned his forces with care. Olympus would hold the core army. Eucletus, his brother, commanded Eva's. The valley between them housed cavalry and lighter troops, ready to exploit openings or respond to threats. The terrain itself was both ally and adversary, a narrow corridor that amplified Spartan discipline, but left no room for error. Every shield, every spear, every movement mattered. Antigonus, for his part, moved with deliberate patience. His larger, well-trained army advanced in coordinated waves, Macedonian phalanx, allied hoplites, and cavalry working as a single machine. He knew that numbers alone would not suffice. Timing, precision, and discipline would decide the outcome. The tension between these armies is almost tangible. Each soldier feels the weight of history, each commander the burden of responsibility. Decisions made here, in these quiet hours before battle, would echo across time. Fear, anticipation, determination, and hope all intermingle in the air. This is the human side of war, the thoughts, the doubts, the courage that are as decisive as any sword. We pause here, on the edge of history. No blood has been shed, yet the stakes could not be higher. 2 cities, 2 kings, 1 narrow pass. The calm is almost unbearable. Yet it is within this stillness that the drama grows. The story of Sellasia is not only about weapons and strategy, but about choices, preparation, and human resilience. Tonight, as we follow these armies into Sellasia, remember, this is a story of ambition, courage, and the fragile hope of a city that once commanded empires. And while the storm of battle has yet to break, the shadow of Macedon grows longer. Every decision made in these hours brings Sparta closer to a confrontation that will test its very soul. So, picture the hills once more, the narrow valley, the soldiers, the silent commanders. Listen to the quiet, feel the tension, and understand that the events about to unfold will decide whether Sparta survives as a free city or fades into history. The story begins here, in the anticipation, in the calm, in the heartbeat before the storm. History often turns on the choices of individuals, and in the case of Sparta's last stand, that individual was Cleomenes III, a king unlike many who came before him. To understand the Battle of Sellasia, we must first understand this man, his world, his reforms, and the shifting web of politics that surrounded him. Sparta, once feared across Greece, had long since passed its golden age. The legendary victories at Thermopylae and Plataea were centuries behind. The Spartan system, designed to produce perfect soldiers, was breaking down. Land ownership had shrunk into the hands of a wealthy few. Many citizens no longer met the requirements to serve as hoplites. The population of true Spartans, known as Spartiates, had dwindled to a dangerous low. The mighty machine of Sparta had rusted. Cleomenes III ascended the throne in 235 BCE. He was young, ambitious, and painfully aware that he had inherited not a city of warriors, but a shadow of its former self. Where others might have accepted decline, Cleomenes refused. He dreamed of restoring the Sparta of legend, a city where discipline, equality, and military strength once again defined its people. But dreams are not achieved through words alone. Cleomenes acted. His first move was a radical land redistribution. Wealthy estates were broken and shared among citizens, ensuring that more men could afford to equip themselves as hoplites. This was not just economics, it was strategy. Without land, men had no place in the Spartan army. By restoring land, Cleomenes restored soldiers. He also revived the agoge, Sparta's harsh training system that molded boys into warriors. Under his reforms, young Spartans once again lived together in barracks, endured hunger and hardship, and learned to obey and endure. They sang old war songs, practiced in the art of discipline, and carried in their hearts the memory of Leonidas and the 300. But Cleomenes' vision extended beyond the walls of Sparta. He understood the politics of Greece were shifting. To the north, Macedonia loomed under King Antigonus III Doson, strong, calculating, and determined to maintain influence over Greek affairs. To the west and south, the Achaean League was rising, a confederation of city-states bound together in mutual defense and cooperation. For Cleomenes, both were obstacles and opportunities. The Achaean League, in particular, became his immediate concern. Led by the skilled statesman Aratus of Sicyon, the League had expanded rapidly, drawing many Peloponnesian cities into its orbit. Sparta's resurgence under Cleomenes threatened this balance, and tension between the two powers grew inevitable. Cleomenes struck first. In the late 220s BCE, his campaigns against the League shocked Greece. With his reformed Spartan army, he seized cities, won allies, and carved a sphere of influence across the Peloponnese. Victories at Mount Lycaeum and Latakia showed that Sparta, though diminished in numbers, was once again a formidable force when guided by strong leadership. For ordinary Spartans, these victories restored pride. For Cleomenes, they built momentum. Yet with every victory, the Achaean League grew more desperate. Aratus, once confident, now saw the Spartan king as a threat that could not be handled alone. And so, in a decision that would alter history, the Achaeans turned north to Macedonia, asking Antigonus for aid. Antigonus accepted, though not out of kindness. A weakened Sparta suited his interests. By intervening, he could check Cleomenes, secure allies, and reinforce Macedonian dominance. Thus, the stage for Sellasia was set not only by military ambition, but by political maneuvering. But before war with Macedonia, Cleomenes faced another challenge: maintaining support at home. His reforms were bold, but not universally welcomed. The wealthy resented the loss of their estates. Traditionalists frowned at his consolidation of power, for he had reduced the influence of the ephors, Sparta's powerful magistrates, concentrating authority in his own hands. To some, he was a savior. To others, a tyrant. Yet the soldiers who marched under him cared little for politics. They had land, pride, and purpose once again. They trained as hoplites, fought as phalangites, and followed their king with the loyalty of men who believed they carried the weight of Sparta's past. Still, the world beyond Sparta's walls grew darker. Antigonus moved deliberately, gathering troops from Macedonia and allied states. The Achaean League, emboldened by Macedonian aid, grew confident once more. Cleomenes, though victorious in early battles, found himself encircled. The odds were shifting, and yet he did not retreat. Instead, he doubled down on his vision. His confidence came not from numbers, but from belief. Belief in the strength of his reformed army belief in the discipline of his men, and belief that a well-chosen battlefield could overcome the Macedonian tide. That battlefield would be Sellasia, a narrow pass between two hills, perfect for a smaller army to resist a larger one. It was here that Cleomenes would make his stand. But we are not yet at the clash of arms. We are still in the slow tightening of history's grip, the tension of decisions that draw closer to war. Imagine Cleomenes in these moments, young, determined, unyielding. He saw himself not as a ruler of decline, but as a restorer of greatness. Every choice, every reform, every battle was aimed at one goal: to give Sparta a chance, a final chance, to survive as a free city. The Achaean League, once nervous, now prepared confidently under Macedonian protection. Antigonus, patient as a predator, waited for the right moment to strike, and all of Greece watched. Some hoped for Spartan victory, others for Macedonian order. Few realized that what was coming would be the last true stand of Sparta. The background to Sellasia is not simply politics or war. It is the story of pride, reform, ambition, and fear. A young king's dream, an old city's struggle, and the encroaching shadow of empires. As night falls over the Peloponnese, in our story, the armies prepare, each step bringing them closer to that narrow valley. The reformer Cleomenes has done all he can. Now, history itself will test whether his vision is strong enough to resist the tide of Macedon. The reforms of Cleomenes III had given Sparta something it had not possessed in generations: confidence. For a moment, it seemed as though the city of Leonidas had found its strength again. The Peloponnese, once dominated by the Achaean League, began to tremble under Spartan arms. In the year 229 BCE, Cleomenes moved with boldness. His new army, smaller than those of other Greek states, but sharpened by discipline, struck swiftly. The Achaean League expected a tired opponent, a relic of the past. Instead, they found themselves on the defensive, surprised at the energy of a revived Sparta. The first great test came at Mount Lycaeum. Here, Cleomenes showed not only bravery, but cunning. His men, positioned on high ground, caught the Achaean forces off guard. The Spartans fought with precision, their spears locking together, their shields forming walls of bronze. The league broke, unable to match the renewed Spartan ferocity. For the first time in decades, Sparta had won a battle that echoed across Greece. News of this victory spread like fire. Cities that had once looked past Sparta now whispered again of its strength. In the taverns of the Peloponnese, men spoke the old names: Leonidas, Brasidas, Agesilaus, and wondered if Cleomenes had restored their legacy. The second test came soon after at Laodicea, near Megalopolis. Once again, Cleomenes took the initiative. His troops, now confident, advanced with precision. The Achaean League fielded numbers, but numbers alone did not decide the day. Cleomenes outmaneuvered them, using speed and discipline to disrupt their formation. When the dust settled, Sparta had claimed another victory. These early successes painted Cleomenes as more than a reformer. He was now a general, a man who had proven that his army could stand against Greece's best. Yet, every victory carried with it a cost. For with each city that turned toward Sparta, the Achaean League grew more desperate. Aratus of Sicyon, leader of the League, was no ordinary statesman. He had guided the League for decades, balancing ambition with caution. But Cleomenes forced him into a corner. The League could not defeat Sparta alone. Its allies wavered. Its people questioned. So Aratus turned north to Macedonia. Here lay the turning point, for the League's plea was not made lightly. To invite Macedonian intervention was to bring a foreign king into Greek affairs, a step many Greeks resented. Yet desperation outweighed pride, and Antigonus, thirsty Doson, the Macedonian king, was eager to oblige. Antigonus was patient, deliberate, and calculating. Unlike Cleomenes, he did not need rapid victories. He had resources, allies, and the great Macedonian phalanx behind him. When Aratus appealed for aid, Antigonus saw not a burden, but an opportunity. By marching south, he could weaken Sparta, strengthen the League, and remind all Greece that Macedonia remained the true arbiter of power. And so, the game shifted. What had begun as a contest between Sparta and the Achaean League became something far larger. Now, it was a confrontation between Cleomenes and Antigonus, a young reformer king against the seasoned ruler of Macedonia. Cleomenes knew this escalation changed everything. His early victories had been against Greek neighbors. Facing the Macedonians was another matter entirely. Their armies were vast, disciplined, and supported by cavalry that could shatter weaker foes. Yet retreat was not an option. To back down would undo everything he had fought for. The land reforms, the revival of the Agoge, the pride of his soldiers, these would vanish if Sparta showed weakness. Instead, Cleomenes pressed forward. He tightened his hold on the Peloponnese, seizing Corinth and threatening the League's unity. For a time, it seemed as though he might hold off both his Greek rivals and the Macedonians gathering to the north. But alliances are fickle. Cities that had once supported Cleomenes began to waver under the pressure of Macedonian diplomacy. Antigonus offered protection, stability, and the weight of his name. One by one, towns that had leaned toward Sparta drifted back into the League's orbit. The dream of a Spartan-led Peloponnese was slipping away, not because of defeat in battle, but because of the slow erosion of loyalty. Cleomenes, ever bold, sought new solutions. He reached out beyond Greece, looking for allies who could balance Macedonian power. He even turned to Egypt, where King Ptolemy III had long maintained interests in Greek affairs. For a while, Egyptian gold flowed into Spartan hands, supporting Cleomenes' reforms and campaigns. But foreign aid was unreliable, subject to politics far beyond Sparta's control. When Ptolemy shifted his priorities, the flow of support dwindled, leaving Cleomenes exposed. By now, the lines were hardening. On one side stood Sparta, proud but isolated, its strength resting on Cleomenes' vision and the loyalty of his soldiers. On the other side stood the Achaean League, bolstered by Macedonian power and confident under Antigonus' command. The balance had tipped, yet in this tightening noose, Cleomenes refused despair. He believed geography could be his ally. If numbers and resources favored Macedonia, then terrain must level the field. He searched for a place where a smaller, disciplined force could resist a larger one. That place, he decided, was the pass near Sellasia. Here, the river Unus cut through the land, flanked by two hills, Mount Aevus and Mount Olympus. The pass was narrow, the ground difficult, a larger army would struggle to deploy its full strength. If Sparta could hold the heights, if Cleomenes could anchor his defense, perhaps even the mighty Macedonian phalanx could be blunted. This was not a decision made in haste. It was the culmination of years of reform, victory, and shifting alliances. Sellasia would not be just another battlefield. It would be the test of everything Cleomenes had built. The lead-up to war was now complete. What began as small Spartan triumphs had swelled into a confrontation with the greatest power in Greece. Cleomenes had rallied a broken city, restored its pride, and faced down the League. But now, the storm gathered in full force. Macedon was coming, and with it, the weight of empire. In the quiet nights before the march to Sellasia, one imagines Cleomenes walking through his camp. Perhaps he paused by the fires of his soldiers, listening to them sing the old war songs. Perhaps he looked at the hills in the distance, calculating how he might use them to shield his men. Perhaps he felt the weight of history on his shoulders, the knowledge that he was not only fighting for land or power, but for the survival of Sparta itself. Soon, the armies would meet. Soon, the valley between Olympus and Evus would echo with the clash of bronze and the cries of men. But not yet. For now, the world held its breath, waiting for the storm to break. The armies of Greece were gathering. After years of reforms, victories, and shifting alliances, the moment had come when men would march, not simply for power, but for survival. To understand the battle that was coming at Sellasia, we must first look at the forces themselves, the soldiers who carried the weight of their king's ambitions, the weapons they bore, and the ground upon which they would meet. Let us begin with Cleomenes III. His Sparta was not the Sparta of Leonidas, nor the vast war machine of earlier centuries. Yet, through determination and reform, he had built something formidable. His army numbered perhaps 20,000 men, not vast compared to Macedonia, but disciplined, hardened, and carrying the pride of a city fighting for its independence. At the core of Cleomenes' force were the Spartan hoplites, citizens trained under the restored agoge. They fought in the Macedonian-style phalanx, long spears bristling outward in a dense wall of shields. This change was one of Cleomenes' boldest reforms, adopting the very tactics of Macedonia itself, where older Spartans had relied on shorter spears and closer ranks. Cleomenes equipped his men with the sarissa, a spear twice the length, designed to hold enemies at bay before they could close. In this, he admitted a truth. To defeat Macedonia, one must fight like Macedonia, but numbers mattered. Cleomenes' phalanx was supported by allied contingents drawn from cities that had thrown in their lot with Sparta. Some came willingly, others under pressure. Among them were mercenaries, seasoned professionals, loyal to pay more than cause. And on the slopes of Mount Evus, his brother Euclides commanded a large force, holding high ground that would anchor the Spartan line. Cleomenes knew his army was outnumbered, but he also knew the value of terrain. The battlefield of Sellasia offered a chance to even the scales. Imagine it, a narrow pass framed by the twin hills of Olympus and Evus. The river Oenus cut through the valley, winding like a silver thread. For a large army, the space was suffocating. For a smaller army, disciplined and placed with care, it was perfect. Cleomenes positioned his men with precision. On the right, he took command himself, holding the slopes of Mount Olympus with the elite of his phalanx. On the left, on Mount Avus, Euclides stood ready with allied troops. Between them, in the valley, cavalry and lighter forces filled the gaps, defending the river crossings and the narrow floor of the pass. It was a defensive masterpiece, designed to force Antigonus into attacking uphill, where discipline and courage might overcome sheer numbers. Now let us look at the other side. Antigonus III, Doson, king of Macedonia, marched with an army estimated at 30,000 men, a host larger, more varied, and supported by the wealth of an empire. At the heart of his force stood the Macedonian phalanx, the most feared infantry formation of the age. Their sarissas, stretching outward in layers, created a forest of spear points, nearly impossible to penetrate from the front. But Antigonus had more than infantry. He brought with him Macedonian cavalry, heirs of Alexander's companions, trained to charge in disciplined wedges. Alongside them were allied Greek contingents, Achaeans eager for revenge, Boeotians fulfilling obligations, and Illyrians drawn from the rugged north. He also fielded mercenaries of his own, men hardened by countless campaigns across the Mediterranean. In numbers, in resources, in sheer weight, Antigonus held the advantage, but numbers alone do not win battles. Strategy, terrain, and the will of men shape the outcome. Antigonus, careful and deliberate, understood the challenge before him. Cleomenes had chosen Sellasia precisely because it favored the defender. To attack uphill against determined Spartans risked disaster. Yet Antigonus could not retreat. To withdraw would weaken his position, embolden Cleomenes, and perhaps unravel the alliances he had worked so carefully to build. So, the two kings faced one another across the valley. For days, scouts probed the hills, cavalry skirmished near the river, and commanders studied the land. Each side sought an opening, a weakness, some advantage to tilt the balance. Cleomenes' plan was simple but bold. By holding the high ground, he hoped to lock the Macedonians in the narrow valley, stretching their formation and dulling their power. His phalanx on Olympus would serve as the hammer, while Euclides' men on Evus formed the anvil. Together, they could trap Antigonus's forces between two fires. Antigonus's plan, by contrast, was patient. He would not charge blindly. Instead, he arranged his army in 3 divisions. On his right, he placed the Illyrians and allies, aimed at Euclides' position on Avus. In the center, his Macedonian phalanx stood ready, prepared to grind forward through the valley. On his left, cavalry and mercenaries faced Cleomenes' own right wing. His intent was clear: to stretch the Spartans, test their defenses, and apply pressure until a weak point revealed itself. In these moments before battle, one can imagine the silence of the land. The hills of Evus and Olympus, so often quiet, now bristled with spears. The valley floor, once cut only by the flow of the Onus, now carried the weight of marching boots and restless horses. Each soldier, Spartan and Macedonian alike, knew that the coming clash would decide more than territory. It would decide whether Sparta remained free or bent beneath the shadow of Macedonia. The strategy of both kings reveals their characters. Cleomenes, young and daring, trusted in the courage of his reformed Sparta, confident that discipline and high ground could resist the empire's might. Antigonus, older and deliberate, relied on patience, coordination, and the weight of numbers. Both men carried history on their shoulders. For Cleomenes, it was the memory of Leonidas, of standing against overwhelming odds. For Antigonus, it was the legacy of Philip and Alexander, rulers who had reshaped the world. The soldiers, too, must be imagined, not as faceless ranks, but as men, Spartans, their armor gleaming in the sun, their shields painted with the lambda of Lacedaemon. Macedonians, their sarissas raised like a forest, their eyes steady beneath bronze helmets. Mercenaries, hardened by long campaigns, murmuring in foreign tongues. Cavalrymen stroking the necks of restless horses, each man knowing that by day's end, the valley of Sellasia would drink deeply of blood. Yet still, as dawn broke on the day of battle, there remained a fragile silence. Both sides were ready, both sides waiting for the signal that would unleash the storm. The valley of Sellasia, silent for centuries, awoke to thunder on that morning in 222 BCE. The Macedonians had assembled, their banners rising against the sky, their phalanx stretching like an endless wall of spears. Across the valley, the Spartans held their ground on the twin hills of Olympus and Evus, their shields catching the light of dawn, their king and his brother waiting for history's judgment. This was no ordinary battle. It was the largest confrontation Sparta had fought in generations, a contest not of equals, but of a proud few against the weight of empire. And yet, in those first moments, hope still lingered that discipline and courage might carve victory from impossible odds. Cleomenes had taken the high ground, his phalanx bristling with sarissas along the slopes of Olympus. Beside him, on the opposite hill, his brother Euclides held Mount Evus with allied contingents ready to strike down upon the valley. Between the hills, cavalry and lighter troops defended the Unos River, their eyes fixed on the Macedonian host, advancing slowly, steadily, like a tide. Antigonus, the Macedonian king, had arranged his men with care. On his right, he placed the Illyrians, fierce warriors from the north, supported by Greek allies. Their target was Euclides' position on Evus. In the center, he commanded the Macedonian phalanx, thousands of men with spears 15 feet long, advancing in disciplined silence. On the left, he stationed cavalry and mercenaries to challenge Cleomenes' own position on Olympus. The battle began with a roar. The Illyrians surged uphill toward Mount Evus, shields raised, spears thrusting. Euclides' men met them with fierce resistance. Stones rolled down the slope, spears clashed, shields locked. For a moment, it seemed the hill would hold. The defenders fought with desperation, knowing that if Evus fell, the valley would open wide. But Antigonus had planned carefully. The Illyrians did not fight alone. Achaean allies pressed alongside them, and Macedonian reinforcements climbed steadily. Step by step, the defenders of Evus were forced back. The slope that had seemed unassailable began to yield under relentless pressure. Euclides, commanding bravely, urged his men to stand firm. Yet the tide was too strong. In the chaos, he fell, struck down as his lines wavered. With their commander dead, the defenders broke. Mount Evus, the Spartan left, was lost. Across the valley, Cleomenes saw the disaster unfold. His brother was gone, his left flank collapsing. The Macedonian banners now waved from the top of Evus. The anvil that was meant to crush Antigonus's army had been shattered, but there was no time to mourn. The king turned his attention to his own hill, Olympus, where the storm was about to break. Here, Cleomenes commanded his strongest troops, the reformed Spartan phalanx. As the Macedonian left advanced, cavalry clashed in the valley below, hooves pounding, dust rising. Horses screamed, riders fell, and the narrow ground became a frenzy of swirling combat. Cleomenes' cavalry, though brave, was outmatched. The Macedonian horse, supported by mercenaries, began to push them back, driving them away from the river crossing. Then came the phalanx. The Macedonian Sarissas pressed uphill, an iron forest advancing step by step. The Spartans, their own Sarissas braced, met them with unyielding determination. Spears shattered, shields rang, men grunted beneath the weight of the push. On Olympus, the struggle became a brutal contest of endurance. Neither side yielded easily. For a time, the Spartans held. Their discipline, restored by Cleomenes' reforms, showed its strength. Line after line of Macedonians crashed against them, only to be checked by the wall of bronze and wood. The high ground gave the Spartans an edge. From behind their shields, they pushed, thrust, and held. But battles are not won by courage alone. The fall of Evas had freed Macedonian troops to shift toward the center. Antigonus, ever patient, saw his opening. He pressed his advantage, ordering fresh divisions into the fray. Now, Cleomenes' men found themselves not only attacked from the front but threatened from the side. The carefully balanced defense began to unravel. The valley echoed with the cries of the dying. Dust clouded the air, mixing with the metallic tang of blood. Soldiers stumbled over the fallen, shields slipping in the press of bodies. The Spartan right, though valiant, began to bend under the pressure. Cleomenes himself fought among his men, urging them to hold. His presence a rallying flame, but flames burn brightest before they fade. At last, the Macedonian weight proved too great. The Spartan phalanx, pressed from the front and flanked from the side, broke. Once a wall of spears, it became a scattered mass of desperate men, cut down as they tried to flee the slope. The narrow valley offered little escape. Cavalry circled, infantry pressed, and what had begun as a contest ended as a rout. Cleomenes, seeing the day lost, gathered what remained of his bodyguard. With a handful of loyal men, he cut his way free of the battlefield. Behind him, Sparta's army lay shattered, its brothers fallen, its dream undone. The cost was immense. Of Cleomenes' 20,000, thousands lay dead, including his brother Euclides. The survivors scattered, broken and leaderless. Antigonus, victorious, stood amidst the carnage, master of Sellasia. For Sparta, independence was gone. For Greece, the age of Macedonian dominance was confirmed once more. Yet in the quiet that followed, the valley bore witness not only to defeat, but to defiance. The Spartans had fought with courage against overwhelming odds. Cleomenes' reforms, his vision, his determination, they had given his city one last moment of glory, even in ruin. The Battle of Sellasia was over, but its echoes would linger, whispered in the memory of Greeks for generations. It was the end of a story that had begun centuries before at Thermopylae, the final stand of a people who had once defied empires. And though Sparta would live on as a city, its independence had perished on that narrow pass between Evus and Olympus. The dust over Sellasia had not yet settled when the truth became clear. The Spartans had lost. What began with the promise of defiance had ended in a storm of broken shields and shattered spears. On the slopes of Olympus, the last disciplined ranks dissolved into fragments. The proud phalanx, so carefully trained, so stubbornly resistant, could no longer withstand the weight of Macedonian steel. The retreat did not happen all at once. At first, it was a bending, a slow sagging of the line under relentless pressure. Men who had stood shoulder to shoulder for hours began to falter. Gaps appeared. One man turned his head, saw the ruin of his comrades, and stepped back. Another followed. Soon, the cohesion, the heart of phalanx warfare, unraveled. The Spartans, once an unbroken wall, became isolated knots of fighters, resisting as best they could. Cleomenes himself fought desperately to hold them together. His voice carried across the field, urging courage, pleading for order. He was more than a king in that moment. He was a man trying to will history to bend, yet history does not bend easily, and the slope of Olympus had become a trap. Macedonian spears jabbed from the front, cavalry swept along the flanks, and soldiers who tried to flee found themselves hemmed in by geography and enemy pursuit. On the other hill, Mount Aevus, the collapse had already been complete. Euclides, Cleomenes' brother, had fallen earlier in the day. His men, leaderless and overwhelmed, had scattered in every direction. Some attempted to flee down into the valley, only to be cut down by Illyrian pursuers. Others tried to climb higher, retreating into rocky terrain, but exhaustion made them easy prey. By the time Aevus was fully in Macedonian hands, the defenders were either dead or routed. For Cleomenes, the sight of Aevus lost, and his brother S. Banner fallen must have struck deeper than any spear. Yet there was no time for grief. He gathered what remained of his royal guard and directed them toward escape. Unlike many kings before him, Cleomenes did not throw his life away in a doomed last stand. He chose instead to survive, perhaps in hope of rebuilding, perhaps simply because, even in defeat, the instinct to live outweighs the urge for glory. The retreat was chaotic. Horses screamed as cavalry trampled through broken infantry. Shields clattered on the rocky ground, discarded by men too tired to carry them further. The Macedonians pressed relentlessly, showing little mercy. Pursuit was their task, and they carried it out with brutal efficiency. Yet here and there, pockets of Spartans resisted, buying precious moments for their comrades. Some formed tiny phalanxes, 5 or 10 men, circling together with shields, locked until the enemy overwhelmed them. These small stands delayed the inevitable, but could not change the outcome. The death toll was staggering. Ancient accounts tell us that of Cleomenes' army, tens of thousands entered the field, but only a fraction escaped. The Spartans and their allies lay in heaps along the slopes of Aevus and Olympus, their bodies testament to courage and futility alike. Among them was Euclides, whose fate sealed the doom of the left wing. His loss not only weakened the defense, but also cut into Cleomenes' spirit. The two brothers had fought together to preserve their homeland. Now, one lay dead, and the other fled into uncertainty. Cleomenes and his surviving guards managed to carve a path out of the battlefield. It was not an orderly withdrawal, but a desperate flight. Shields turned backward, swords drawn to fend off pursuit. They made their way through narrow passes and hidden paths, using their knowledge of the terrain to slip away from Macedonian patrols. At last, Cleomenes reached the city of Sparta itself, bringing with him only the smallest remnant of the once proud army. For Sparta, the shock was immediate. The citizens had watched their king march out with thousands of soldiers. Now, only a few weary men returned, carrying the heavy truth of defeat. The people grieved, not only for the dead, but for the independence they had cherished for centuries. They knew the Macedonians would not leave the matter unfinished. Sellasia had not been a skirmish. It had been a decisive blow, one that opened the gates of Sparta to foreign domination. Meanwhile, Antigonus and his army remained at Sellasia. The battlefield was theirs, though it was littered with the cost of victory. Even for the Macedonians, the struggle had been fierce. The phalanx had endured hours of resistance, and the slopes had run with blood from both sides. Yet victory was decisive, and Antigonus wasted no time in consolidating his triumph. His soldiers stripped the fallen of arms and armor, a grim harvest of war. The dead were left as silent witnesses, their sacrifice absorbed into the valley's soil. Eucleides, the Spartan prince, was among them. His body, fallen in the defense of Evus, symbolized the end of Sparta's hope. Cleomenes had escaped, but his brother's death ensured that even survival would feel hollow. It was not merely a military loss. It was a personal wound that cut to the core of Spartan leadership. The bond of the two brothers, one holding Olympus, the other Evus, had been their greatest strength. Once broken, the army had no center left to rally around. The psychological weight of this defeat cannot be overstated. For centuries, Spartans had been raised to believe they were unconquerable, that their discipline and courage could withstand any adversary. Sellasia shattered that illusion. For the first time, the full might of Macedonian power had been felt in the heart of Laconia, and the Spartans had discovered that even their legendary resilience had limits. And so, the retreat of Cleomenes marked not just the end of a battle, but the collapse of an era. The independence of Sparta, guarded fiercely for generations, had slipped away on the slopes of Sellasia. What remained was survival, a king in flight, a city vulnerable, and a people forced to face a future they had long denied. As night fell over the battlefield, the fires of the Macedonian camp flickered against the hillsides. The valley that had echoed with shouts and cries now lay in silence, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the whisper of the wind through broken spears. Sparta's dream was over. The battlefield of Sellasia had fallen quiet, where only hours before the valley thundered with the clash of iron and the cries of men. Now there was only silence, broken by the rustle of wind over bodies that would never rise again. Victory belonged to Antigonus and the Macedonians. Defeat, crushing and undeniable, lay heavy on the shoulders of Sparta. For Sparta, the aftermath of Sellasia was unlike anything in its long history. The city that had once stood at the pinnacle of Greek power, the city of Leonidas, the city that had defied empires, was now stripped bare. The army that Cleomenes had built with such care no longer existed. Its spears lay shattered on the slopes of Olympus and Evus, its warriors either slain, captured, or scattered in flight. Cleomenes himself, having escaped the battlefield with only a small guard, returned briefly to Sparta. But he did not linger. He knew that the Macedonians would march straight for the city, and he also knew that Sparta, with its walls long neglected, could not withstand a siege. For centuries, Spartans had prided themselves on their open city, their defense being not stone walls but the valor of their men. Now, with the men gone, there was nothing left to protect the homeland. In the dark hours after Sellasia, Cleomenes made his choice. He gathered his family, his closest allies, and what little wealth he could salvage. Then, before the Macedonian army could arrive, he fled. His path led him not north toward allies, nor west into the mountains, but across the sea. With a handful of ships, Cleomenes sailed to Egypt, seeking refuge at the court of Ptolemy III, the ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty in Alexandria. It was a bitter exile. Cleomenes had gambled everything: his reforms, his wars, his vision of a revived Sparta, on the Battle of Sellasia. Now, that vision was reduced to ashes. In Alexandria, he was received as a guest, but also as a king without a kingdom, a man whose throne had been taken by foreign hands. To the Egyptians, he was useful as a potential pawn against Macedon. To himself, he was a shadow of what he once had been. Back in Greece, Antigonus wasted no time in consolidating his victory. He marched directly to Sparta, his army passing through the ruined valley and advancing unopposed into Laconia. For the first time in its history, Sparta was occupied by a foreign king. This was no raid, no passing army. It was a conquest. Antigonus entered the city not as a guest, but as a master. Yet, interestingly, he did not destroy Sparta. He could have razed it to the ground, enslaved its people, and erased its legacy. Instead, Antigonus acted with surprising restraint, perhaps out of respect for Sparta's past, perhaps out of pragmatism. He chose mercy. He left the city standing. Though its independence was gone, the citizens were allowed to remain, but their destiny would now be shaped not by Spartan kings, but by Macedonian power and the influence of the Achaean League. The reforms of Cleomenes, his redistribution of land, his empowerment of the poor, his revival of military discipline, were undone. The traditional Spartan elite, those whom Cleomenes had overthrown, regained their influence. In this way, Sparta reverted not to greatness, but to weakness. It became a city of memory rather than action, a place known for what it had been rather than what it was. For the people of Sparta, the psychological blow was as heavy as the military defeat. Generations had grown up believing that their city was unconquerable. They were taught from childhood that no enemy could breach their defenses because their defense was their courage. Sellasia proved otherwise. The foreign banners flying over their land were undeniable proof that the age of Spartan dominance had ended. Meanwhile, in Alexandria, Cleomenes found himself trapped by circumstances. At first, Ptolemy III treated him with honor, promising support and even hinting that one day Sparta might be restored through Egyptian aid. But politics is ever shifting, and when Ptolemy III died, his successor, Ptolemy IV, had little interest in Cleomenes. The Spartan king became less of a guest and more of a prisoner. Watched closely, his movements restricted. The bitterness of exile grew heavy. Cleomenes had fought not merely for power, but for a vision of Sparta renewed. In Egypt, he watched that dream wither. His followers, loyal though they were, could do little but share his frustration. For a time, he plotted uprisings, hoping to rally Egyptian soldiers or Greek mercenaries to his cause. Yet none of these plans succeeded. Eventually, the dream ended tragically. Cleomenes, denied freedom, took his own life rather than live as a captive in a foreign land. His death marked the final chapter of his struggle. A man who had dared to challenge empires, but found himself undone by fate and politics alike. In Greece, Antigonus's victory at Sellasia had broader consequences. It cemented Macedonian influence over the Peloponnese. The Achaean League, which had allied with Antigonus, grew stronger under his protection. But this stability was temporary, for within a few years, Antigonus himself would face new challenges. Still, for that brief moment, Macedon stood unchallenged, and Sparta lay silent under its shadow. The aftermath of Sellasia was not simply the fall of a city. It was the end of a way of life. For centuries, Sparta had been defined by its independence, its unwillingness to bow to outside powers. Sellasia changed that forever. Though the city would continue to exist, it would never again play a decisive role in Greek affairs. Its warriors would never again march to shape the destiny of Greece. Instead, Sparta became a relic, remembered more for its past than for its present. And yet, in the quiet reflection of history, there is something deeply human in this aftermath. The Spartans fought with courage against impossible odds. Cleomenes dreamed of a better future and worked tirelessly to achieve it. Their defeat was not due to cowardice or weakness, but to the sheer weight of forces arrayed against them. In that sense, Sellasia was not merely a tragedy, but also a testament, a reminder that even the greatest must one day yield, and that courage does not always guarantee victory. As night settled over Sparta, in the days after the battle, the city lay under foreign watch, its people uncertain of what tomorrow would bring. But the echoes of Sellasia lingered. For those who had lived through it, the memory of that day, the dust, the cries, the fall of Evis and Olympus, would never fade. And for the rest of history, the Battle of Sellasia would stand as a marker, the last stand of Sparta, the final breath of its independence, the closing of a chapter that had begun centuries before with Leonidas at Thermopylae. The dust of Sellasia eventually faded, and the battlefield grew silent once more. Yet the memory of that day, in 222 BCE, lingered long after the last soldier had fallen. For the people of Greece, and for history itself, the Battle of Sellasia carried meaning beyond the clash of arms. It was not merely a fight between two kings. It was the symbolic end of an era. To understand why, we must step back and reflect on what Sellasia truly represented. Sparta had once stood at the heart of Greek identity. For centuries, the name of Sparta had been synonymous with discipline, endurance, and an almost unshakable independence. Its warriors, raised from childhood to fight, had defined themselves by their refusal to yield. The tale of Leonidas and his 300 at Thermopylae was not just a story of war. It was a story of spirit, the belief that courage could resist even the greatest of empires. Sellasia echoed that legacy, but in a darker key. Just as Thermopylae had marked a heroic stand against Persia, Sellasia became the last stand of Sparta itself. But unlike Thermopylae, there was no revival afterward. no ultimate victory. Instead, Sellasia closed the door on Sparta's independence forever. In this way, the battle became a mirror of decline, a reminder that even the strongest traditions eventually bend beneath the weight of time and change. The historical significance of Sellasia lies first in its political consequences. The defeat ended any real chance of Sparta remaining a dominant force in Greek affairs. After Sellasia, the city became a minor power, overshadowed by larger leagues, Macedonian kings, and eventually Roman legions. Its days of deciding the fate of Greece were gone. Where once Sparta had marched at the head of armies that defeated Athens and challenged Persia, now it stood as a dependent city, its autonomy compromised, its future dictated by others. But there is also a deeper, almost symbolic meaning. Sellasia was not simply a military loss. It was the collapse of a social experiment. Cleomenes III had tried to restore the discipline of old Sparta, reviving the land reforms, rebuilding the citizen body, and forging a phalanx modeled on the Macedonian system. His vision was bold, even radical. For a brief time, it seemed to succeed. Sparta was rejuvenated. Victories came swiftly, and the city once again seemed capable of shaping Greek politics. And yet, Sellasia revealed the limits of that vision. Even with reforms, even with discipline, Sparta could not stand alone against the combined might of Macedon, the Achaean League, and their allies. The world had changed. Power was no longer determined by the small citizen armies of city-states, but by vast coalitions, professional soldiers, and monarchies with resources far greater than a single polis could command. Sellasia was the proof that the age of the independent Greek city-state had passed. This is why historians often see Sellasia as more than a battle. It was a turning point. After this, Sparta's role in history shifted from active participant to remembered legend. Its independence was gone, but its reputation endured. When later generations spoke of courage, of unbending discipline, they looked not to the aftermath of Sellasia, but to the memories of Thermopylae. In this sense, Sparta became more powerful in myth than it was in reality. There is also a personal layer to the significance of Sellasia. The story of Cleomenes III himself adds depth to the meaning of the battle. Here was a king who dared to dream of revival, who looked at his struggling city and sought to breathe new life into it. He did not accept decline quietly. He fought it, reformed against entrenched elites, and risked everything in the hope of restoring Sparta's greatness. His courage and vision, even in failure, gave Sparta one last moment of brilliance before the fall. But Sellasia teaches another lesson as well, that courage and vision are not always enough. History is shaped not only by individuals, but by forces greater than them. Cleomenes may have reformed, he may have dreamed, but Macedon's armies were larger, its resources deeper, its allies more numerous. Against that, even Sparta's iron discipline could not prevail. This truth resonates beyond ancient Greece. It is a universal reminder that societies, no matter how strong, cannot escape the weight of larger historical currents. For modern audiences, especially those listening now, the Battle of Sellasia offers a strange comfort. It reminds us that even the greatest civilizations face decline, and that decline is not always the result of weakness, but of change. Sparta did not fall because it lacked courage. It fell because the world moved on. And in that, there is a lesson about resilience. Even when independence is lost, Even when power fades, memory endures. The Spartans who stood at Sellasia may have been defeated, but their story is still told more than 2,000 years later. In the quiet hours, when we reflect on Sellasia, it feels almost like the closing scene of a great drama. The stage is filled with echoes: the clash of phalanxes, the fall of Euclides, the retreat of Cleomenes, and then the curtain falls. The audience is left in silence, reflecting not on victory, but on loss, and on the strange dignity that loss can carry. This is the deeper historical significance. Sellasia transformed Sparta from a living power into a legend, and legends, unlike armies, cannot be conquered. They live on in stories, in lessons, in the whispers of history carried forward across centuries. For the Greeks who lived through it, the meaning was immediate. Sparta was finished as a force. For us, looking back, the meaning is broader. It was the moment when the old order of Greece gave way to something new, when the small city-states yielded to the larger kingdoms, when the age of independence yielded to the age of empires. And yet, in all of this, there remains a spark of admiration. The Spartans did not go quietly. They stood on their hills, held their ground, and fought until their lines collapsed. They showed that even in the face of overwhelming odds, courage remains. And though courage cannot always secure victory, it leaves behind something just as enduring: memory. Sellasia, then, is not just a story of defeat. It is a story of endurance, of vision, of the final flicker of a flame that once lit all of Greece. And as long as history is told, that flame, though faint, will never be fully extinguished. And so, the story of the Battle of Sellasia draws to its end. What began with hope and defiance on the hills of Olympus and Evus concluded in dust, silence, and the fading of an age. For Sparta, it was the last stand. For Greece, it was a turning point. And for history, it became one of those rare moments where the fall of a single city seemed to mark the closing of a chapter that had shaped the world. To understand the conclusion of Sellasia, we must remember where it began. Cleomenes III, a king who looked upon his city and saw decline, dared to dream of renewal. He had pushed against tradition, redistributed land, restored discipline, and forged a new army to match the Macedonian phalanx. He fought not merely for power, but for a vision that Sparta could once again rise, not just as a memory of greatness, but as a living force in the politics of Greece. For a time, that dream seemed possible. Victories came, enemies hesitated, and Sparta stood taller than it had in generations. Yet history is often cruel to dreamers. At Sellasia, the weight of Macedon and the Achaean League crashed down upon him. Despite courage, despite discipline, despite the hills chosen with care, Sparta was undone. And here lies the heart of the conclusion. Sellasia was not simply a defeat on the battlefield, it was a defeat of possibility. With the fall of Cleomenes, the idea of a revived Sparta vanished. The city survived, yes, but only as a shadow of its former self. It would never again shape the destiny of Greece. The story of Cleomenes himself deepens the poignancy of this ending. Exiled in Egypt, far from the mountains of Laconia, he became a king without a throne. His death, tragic and lonely, reflected the fate of his city. Both the man and the polis had reached for greatness and found only the hard truth of limits. Together, their stories ended in silence, their hopes carried away on the tide of history. But the conclusion of Sellasia is not only about what was lost, it is also about what was revealed. The battle showed, with undeniable clarity, that the age of small, independent city-states had ended. The world of Greece was now a world of leagues, monarchies, and empires. Power no longer belonged to isolated cities, but to those who could command vast coalitions and resources. In this sense, Sellasia was not just about Sparta. It was about Greece itself, about the shift from the classical age into something new. And yet, even as it marked an end, Sellasia also ensured that Sparta would never be forgotten. Defeat can sometimes carve memory more deeply than victory. The courage of the Spartans, their desperate resistance, their willingness to fight to the last breath, these left impressions that outlived the Macedonian triumph. Just as Thermopylae became a story not of loss but of glory, so too did Sellasia remain in memory as the last act of a proud people. For us, looking back across centuries, the conclusion of Sellasia feels almost like the closing scene of a long and tragic play. The curtain falls, the audience sits in silence, and the meaning lingers long after the actors are gone. It is a story of ambition, of vision, of courage, and of inevitability. A story where human effort pushed against the tide of history only to be swept away. But there is comfort here as well. Sellasia reminds us that even in defeat, there is dignity. The Spartans may have lost their independence, but they did not lose their identity, their courage, their reforms, their final stand. All of these ensured that they would be remembered, not as a city forgotten, but as a symbol of resilience. This is the unique gift of history, that even endings become beginnings in memory. The fall of Sparta at Sellasia marked the rise of new powers, but it also preserved the legend of a people who refused to bow easily. And legends, unlike cities, do not die. They live on in stories told at night, in whispers carried across time, in the imagination of those who still find meaning in courage against impossible odds. For the Greeks of the time, the conclusion of Sellasia was painful. They saw in it the proof that their world was changing forever. For us, thousands of years later, it is something else entirely. It is a reminder that greatness is fragile, that every civilization has its limits, and that even the proudest must one day yield. But it is also a reminder that memory transcends loss. So, as we close this story, let us step back once more and picture the scene. The valley of Sellasia, quiet beneath the evening sky, the hills of Olympus and Evus, where men once fought and fell, now covered in the soft green of time. The wind passes over them, carrying no cries of war, only silence. Yet within that silence, the memory remains. The last stand of Sparta, the final breath of its independence, the echo of courage that still speaks to us across the centuries. And in that echo, we find the true conclusion. Sparta may have fallen, but the story endures. And as long as it is told, the flame of Sellasia, faint though it may be, will never fully go out. As the echoes of Sellasia fade, we are left not with the clash of swords, but with silence. The dust settles, the soldiers vanish, and history moves forward. Yet in that silence, something remains: questions, reflections, and whispers that reach across time. For the Battle of Sellasia is not only about Sparta or Macedon or the politics of the 3rd century before our era. It is also about us, about human ambition, human struggle, and the fragile thread of destiny that binds us all. When we reflect on Sparta's final stand, we first see courage. Imagine being one of those Spartans standing on the slopes of Avis or Olympus, knowing the odds were against you. The Macedonian phalanx stood vast and disciplined, the cavalry stronger, the allies of Macedon many, and yet you stood your ground. You tightened the straps of your armor, gripped the spear more firmly, and whispered a prayer not for survival, but for honor. To fight, even when defeat was certain, was to affirm something greater than victory. It was to affirm identity. That, perhaps, is the first lesson Sellasia leaves us, that there is dignity even in resistance. But as we reflect further, we see tragedy. Cleomenes had vision. He dreamed of a Sparta renewed, a Sparta capable of standing against the tide of larger powers. His reforms were bold, his determination unwavering. Yet history is rarely kind to visionaries who arrive too late. By the time Cleomenes rose, the world of the independent polis had already begun to pass. Macedonia, leagues, and empires, these were now the architects of destiny, and so Cleomenes' struggle was not only against Antigonus, but against time itself. The tragedy of Sellasia is not simply that Sparta lost, but that its very dream was out of step with the age. Still, even tragedy has meaning. To reflect on Sellasia is to reflect on change itself. No civilization, no matter how proud, is immune to the tides of history. Sparta had once been the terror of Greece. Its warriors feared across the land. Yet centuries later, that power had eroded, and no reform could fully restore it. The message is simple. Greatness is never permanent. It must be nurtured, renewed, and adapted, or else it fades. For us today, this reflection is sobering. We live in our own civilizations, proud of our own achievements, yet history whispers, nothing lasts forever. But Sellasia also gives us hope, for though Sparta fell, its memory endured. Defeat did not erase it from the pages of history. Instead, it etched its legacy even deeper. The Spartans are remembered not for their victories alone, but for their spirit. Thermopylae, Plataea, and Sellasia, all of these remind us that courage leaves a mark, even when outcomes are grim. And so, the reflection turns hopeful. Though we may not always control the result of our struggles, we do control the way we face them. And in that, we shape how we are remembered. There is another reflection, quieter, but just as profound. The nature of endings. Sellasia was an end. Yes, the end of Spartan independence, the end of Cleomenes' dream, but it was also a beginning for Macedon's dominance, for Rome's future entry into Greek affairs, for the slow shift toward empire that would define the Mediterranean world. Endings and beginnings are always intertwined. As one chapter closes, another silently opens. History reminds us that nothing truly vanishes. It transforms. And so, what can we take from Sellasia into our own lives? Perhaps this: when change comes, it is natural to resist. We cling to what we know, what we have built, what defines us. Sparta resisted with spears. Cleomenes resisted with reforms. They lost, yes, but their resistance itself gave their story meaning. We, too, may face changes we cannot prevent. Yet how we face them, whether with fear or with courage, becomes the story others tell of us. That is the lasting lesson of Sellasia. Not that Sparta fell, but that Sparta chose to fall with dignity intact. As you let these reflections settle, picture again the valley of Sellasia. Night has fallen. The battlefield is quiet. The hills of Olympus and Evus stand watch, timeless and unmoved. In the dark, the memories of the fallen whisper through the wind. Their voices do not speak of defeat. They speak of endurance, of a people who stood until they could stand no more. Listen carefully, and you might hear them, not as ghosts, but as echoes. Echoes reminding us that courage matters, that honor endures, and that even in loss, there is meaning. Now let the story soften, like a fading dream. Imagine yourself walking through that valley, centuries after the battle. No soldiers remain, no banners fly, only grass, stone, and silence. And yet, the weight of history is there, gentle but firm, like the pulse of the earth itself. You pause, take a breath, and realize that you are part of this same story. Just as Sparta rose and fell, so too do we rise and fall, each in our time. And just as their memory endures, so too might ours, if we live with courage. This is the gift of sleepless battles. These stories are not only of kings and armies, but of us, of the timeless human spirit that searches for meaning in the face of uncertainty. They are not only history, but lullabies of resilience, carried softly across the centuries. So, as we close this reflection, let us leave with a final thought. The Battle of Sellasia was not merely the end of Sparta. It was a reminder that every ending is also a story told, every fall also a lesson, every silence also an echo. And in listening to these echoes, we connect ourselves to something larger, something enduring, something that transcends the noise of the present. Rest now with that thought. Let it linger. The story is complete. The Spartans have spoken, and in their silence, you have found not just history, but a reflection of your own journey. Sleep gently, for the battle is over. The lesson remains, and the echoes of Sellasia will stay with you, softly, through the night. Thank you for watching.